Thanks everyone for joining us today. My name is Andrew Sporer. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communication here at Chmura Economics and Analytics, and I'm excited to introduce Chmura's CEO and Chief Economist, Dr. Chris Chmura, and Senior VP and Director of Infrastructure and Economic Development at McGuireWoods Consulting, Mr. Chris Lloyd. Our speakers are here today to discuss the relationship between housing and economic development. We've got a great turnout, so I'm excited to get started. Before we do, I just want to cover a few brief housekeeping items. I see we've got some activity in the chat already. Thank you so much for your participation there. You'll also note a poll function as well. Myself and Chris, as well as Chris Lloyd, will direct your attention there throughout the call, so please do feel free to participate. That'll help inform the content that we serve to you today. As a reminder, yes, the presentation and the slides will be distributed after the call. We should have them out very shortly thereafter, hopefully by tomorrow, if not by the end of the week. Be on the lookout for an email from us with a link to access those materials. Again, if you have any questions, please use the chat function. I'll be monitoring throughout the webinar, and we do save some time at the end of the call to try and get through those if we don't answer them before. All right, that's it. Let's get rolling here. Just some 30,000 foot information about Chmura Economics and Analytics for those of you who are not familiar. Chmura provides labor market data and analysis through three main offerings: Jobs EQ, or flagship software, custom consulting services, as well as access to data for integration with API. We were founded in 1998 by Chris. We are celebrating our 25th year. Congratulations to Chris and all who have made that milestone possible. We have two offices, one in Cleveland, Ohio, and another in Richmond, Virginia, from where we are broadcasting today. But we do serve clients all across the country. As a team, we care about helping our customers grow, both their businesses and their communities. We like to say that we share in our customer success. So our goal is truly your satisfaction and your growth. And lastly, we're driven by excellence, first and foremost, both in our customer service, our data quality. It informs literally everything we do. In fact, I think it's what differentiates us most, whether it's in the data that we offer, our customer support, the quality of our analytics and consulting services. Excellence is our top priority. That commitment has translated into an over 90% annual renewal rate for our Jobs EQ customers. I think that's testament to the ongoing partnership and the communication we maintain with all of our users. Those are just a few of the things that we hear in our renewal conversations. So I'm glad our customers appreciate that. Speaking of the customers, the labor market data, the software, the consulting services that we offer can benefit a wide range of industries, from our corporate clients who need competitive analysis and benchmarking, to our partners in economic development seeking insights on labor availability in their region, to higher education institutions who need labor market data to plan their academic offerings, for example. For those in site selection, which Chris Lloyd will dig into further, who need to compare wages, average commute time between sites, staffing agencies, talent acquisition professionals who are looking for potential customers, wage insights, and information on who is hiring and for what roles, or for those in workforce development who want to track real-time changes in their economy and identify which occupations and skills would provide the most opportunity for their local workforces. Here's just a quick snapshot of the customers, some of them that we serve. But without further ado, let's get on to the subject that we have been waiting for. I'll pass it to Dr. Chris Chmura for a quick temperature check on the national housing market and an overview of a study we recently completed for Virginia Housing before passing it over to Chris Lloyd, who will discuss policy as well as the nuanced relationship between housing and economic development. Chris?
Thanks, Andrew. Quickly before we get started, the economy is just so important right now in terms of people still maybe talking about a recession. We have a weekly economic update that we put out every weekend, looks at the prior information that came out, the reports. We highlight some of the largest or the most important reports on the second page. The third page, we look at what the Fed may have been saying with regard to inflation, interest rates, and then we provide on the last page our interest rate forecast and some financial indicators. So you're welcome to click and sign up for this complimentary update. Thanks to all of you for answering the poll. So it's clear why you are here. You have heard a lot about housing when you're doing your economic development expansions, based on over 40% of those responding to that poll saying that yes, most conversations, or nearly every or all conversations, revolve around housing as one of the issues. So as Andrew said, I'll start off by talking just very brief national housing trends. Then we'll look at a study we recently did for Virginia with regard to housing. And then I'll end with showing you a way you can estimate the additional demand for housing that would be needed from business expansions. And then Chris will follow up, Chris Lloyd, talking about, again, housing, how important it is for economic mobility, and how policies have recently changed around housing that removes some obstacles. I think with that, we're now going to see another poll, or very soon we'll see another poll coming up. And I will just continue on and just be on the lookout for that second poll. It's starting now. So actually, let me go ahead. Let me talk a little bit here, and then as soon as that sets up fully, I'll take a break for you to answer that. So first, the national overview. In terms of the housing market in the nation, we all know the issues. They've decreased economic competitiveness pretty much across the nation, although it varies in different areas around the country. But clearly, one issue is high prices. And here you're looking at the Case-Shiller Housing Price Index that is based on some of the largest MSAs in the country. So you can see the gray shaded area is the COVID recession, and clearly double-digit increases in rates of housing prices going up. But even previous to that, in 2013, we saw some very high increasing housing prices, and most recently they've ticked up again, not as high as during COVID, but we're looking at around 4 to 5% in terms of prices going up. On this next slide now, we have high borrowing costs. So we have the situation where we're looking at 6.5 to 7%, which has taken some people out of the market in terms of being able to afford a home. But the bigger picture here, I think, is if you look at 2001 to 2002, and notice that we're seeing mortgage rates down around 3%, which has created part of that low supply problem for us. So if you're in a home, you have a 3% interest rate, you want to expand to a larger home, but at 6.5 to 7%, you're not going to be able to buy much more home because of the higher borrowing costs. So as a result, these people who are in these low mortgage homes are not putting their houses on the market. So we have low supply from the pre-owned homes. We also have low supply because homes are not being built, new houses are not being built as fast as they were during the post-COVID era. Part of those issues there are finding the construction workers, finding the land. Not enough land was purchased by developers in the recent past, and so those are some of the issues that we're running into there from the housing side. Before we move on, let's take a look at the poll here. How has the number of questions about housing you encounter in your workforce changed, or in your work changed over the last year? And clearly the trend is that more people are seeing that question asked about housing. So housing is becoming a more important issue. And as I said a little while ago, it varies by region. So this map is from the Federal Housing Finance Agency. You can click on the source at the bottom when you get the presentation, and it will take you to an interactive map where you can click on any of the MSAs or states that they're showing here, with the dark blue areas show the highest increase in housing prices, and then the red or maroon color showing you where some housing prices are actually declining. And you can see there are very few areas where we are seeing home prices declining. So now to the study that Chmura was retained to perform for Virginia housing. And it was completed in November of 2023. If you would like to see a full copy of it, you could click on the link that we're showing you here to read the entire study. But the primary goals of this study were first to understand the role of housing in local and state economic competitiveness through interviews and focus groups. So we had 70 interviews. We also many of these individuals were in the state of Virginia, but we also interviewed site selectors across the country. The type of people we interviewed in the state: economic developers, workforce developers or professionals, home builders associations, and you'll see some of their results here, and also in the study if you download that. And a second goal was to document examples of other regions and states where they're integrating housing and economic development strategies. And we found this in local areas where they had strategies of economic development and housing, but there was no other state across the country that had strategies around housing in their economic development plans. One state, North Carolina, did mention housing in their economic development, but they did not have a strategy around it. So Virginia was interested in seeing what could they do to solve this housing problem that you are all seeing as you're bringing in expanding firms. And then the third goal was to identify next steps in aligning economic development and housing needs and goals. So here we're seeing that just like I'm sure many of you saw who answered the poll, regions share common barriers to increasing housing supply. And the main reasons are shown here that we came up with from our focus groups and interviews: unavailable resources, land, construction workers were hard to find, and that increased the cost of the housing. That varied greatly in urban and rural areas. And then secondly, regulations were outdated, zoning and permit codes, and I'm sure Chris Lloyd will talk more about this when he speaks. Lack of infrastructure. Utilities are very costly to put in, especially in rural areas. And then broadband or internet is an issue in some rural areas. And then finally, NIMBYism, or not in my backyard. So we're all about seeing some high rises go in, but not if it has to be near me. There was a great article in the Wall Street Journal a few weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago, where they pointed out in Northern Virginia, Alexandria, that yes, there is a housing crisis, but no, you can't build it here. And that was in Delray in Alexandria. So clearly some issues that we're seeing across the state, and I'm sure you probably are in your own regions.
In fact, Chris, if I might, I was going to say I've started talking in economic development circles about a new acronym that I call BANANAism, and that's that I think the public is getting to the point of build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. Is nobody wants any growth, no matter what, and so it's a real challenge. I was also wondering, did y'all what about the role of inflation? Did that come up in y'all's research?
Yes, it did. Clearly, inflation is a huge issue here, and that being brought on by some of the shortages that we saw during COVID. But yeah, clearly another underlying issue that's making homes more unaffordable. Thanks, Chris. Okay, so now I'm just going to give you a few state level recommendations because Chris Lloyd is going to hit on broader recommendations that he sees or has seen from across the nation. So first, from a state perspective, in particular, the first two items: incorporate economic development goals in housing plans and housing and economic development plans. And like I said earlier, in our analysis, we couldn't find a state level strategic plan or economic development strategic plan that had housing as a central and important piece to it. And then secondly, align economic development and housing planning. So if you have a site in your region, are you thinking about how many new people are going to come into the area because of the type of industry that you're trying to bring in? So I'm going to give you an example of that in a few minutes to walk you through how you can think about who should I market, what industries, based on the availability of housing I have and the stock of housing I have. And then third, the state can provide resources. One way they can do that is in terms of making sure that they're addressing the biggest barriers to economic growth, making sure that the regions, the localities have the capacity to use state and local dollars with that regard, and then to foster collaboration. So is there a clear line of communication between the Department of Housing and Community Development, between workforce and also with the economic developers? Are they all able to collaborate and have a line of communication with each other? And then finally, another thing that came up was increased housing data availability and transparency. It's hard to find housing data that's real time. And oftentimes then, or sometimes, some economic developers are left with just using what they could get, pulling data from Zillow, or maybe using census data that's pre-COVID, so it's old. So that, again, was one thing that was brought up. One thing that localities may want to consider as well is to make sure that the GIS mapping for the zoning is easy to find and easy to download and analyze for people who are trying to assess the availability of housing in their region. So now I'm going to take you through, and hopefully you've had a cup of coffee, measuring housing demand from an economic expansion. So we have some numbers here, and some of you have seen the third question, and that is, if you have a site that you are marketing, have you thought about the number of new housing units or apartments that would be needed for the new workers? So 63% of you said no, that you haven't. 27%, glad to hear that, say that they have a process to estimate the housing stock. And then 10% here looking at consultants to help them answer that question. So thank you for answering that as well. And I see some people are continuing to answer that question. So we'll leave that poll open for a minute. So here's a process that I'm going to walk you through that we actually worked with the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. So this analysis is based on analysis that we worked with them. So basically, how should we think about what economic development targets we should be going after? Manufacturing, transportation, data centers are three examples that we're showing you here. So we received some of this data from the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, looking at the successes that they've had over the past few years and looking at the number of jobs that were created, the building square feet per acre, and we also received data from the Energy Information Administration. So that Energy Information Administration had the workers per square foot. So you could see here that in manufacturing, we're looking at an average of 6,492 acres, building square feet per acre. The jobs per acre would be 8.8, and that would be 1.3 jobs per 1,000 square foot. Now, the reason why we took this approach is because we wanted to get a sense of, okay, if we have a plot of land, several acres, hundreds of acres, what kind of firm should we attract? But if you're working with a site selector or an expanding firm, they'll give you this information. So you can do the analysis based on the information you have. But in this case, again, our question was different. It was, how should we use a particular site? So the example I'm going to go through is a 75-acre site. You see it's on a railroad. And we're going to look at a 1-hour drive time, the workforce within 1 hour of that site, to see how many workers we might need for an expanding firms. On the type of firm, we've decided to go with a warehouse. So 75 acres, 10.8 jobs per acre. That leads to 818 workers that we have to fill. And so here we pulled some data from our Jobs EQ, and it's the what if report, where if we have 818 workers in a transportation and warehouse facility, then the most jobs that are going to be needed are the first line there, heavy and tractor trailer truck drivers. To go through what some of these numbers are, the employer demand would be 133. We currently have 3,900 in this region, 105 unemployed heavy truck drivers. The regional wage is 47,700 below the national wage. And this employment extended represents workers in other industries that could fill that position. And then this last column, very important. When we work with site selectors and expanding firms, they tell us that they like to see 50 people available or working or unemployed for every one role they're trying to fill for that occupation. So if this last column is not green, then that means we don't have enough workers. And you can see that in this case, it's the only occupation where we have enough workers is stockers and order fillers. So then the next step becomes to try to figure out, okay, how many people are going to have to move into the region because we don't have enough workers here, and then we'll translate that into housing. So what we chose to do is, if this last column is not at least 50, that means we're going to have to bring some candidates in from another region. They're going to have to relocate. And we also looked at the unemployment. So we said, if the number of unemployed, so that's the third column of numbers, if the number of unemployed is not greater than the new employer demand, then that also means we're going to have to bring people in. So in the case of the truck drivers, the first row, you can see there that we have 105 unemployed, but we need 133. So clearly we're going to have to bring people in. And also the candidate per opening is 31. So clearly we're going to have to bring people in. In fact, again, looking at all of the occupations shown here, it's going to mean that we're going to be bringing people into our region, meaning that we're going to need more housing. So now on this next slide, we relied on the ACS table. This table, in case you're interested in looking at this for your area, S2 503, and it gives financial characteristics, average renter owner mix by zip code and housing costs. So looking at the first column here, we're looking at the monthly housing costs for people who are in a house that are paying less than $300 a month. In that case, in this particular region, there were 2,765 people in that region that were paying less than $300 a month. Of those, 2,400 actually owned their house and 309 rented an apartment or a house. So 89% ownership in this category where they were paying less than $300 a month. And as you go down, for example, those who are paying $3,000 or more, not surprisingly, 79 housing units occupied in this region with people paying $3,000 or more, and all of them, 100% of them, were owner occupied. So to get down to the local level of what does the current mix look like, how many houses are available at different price points, you can go to the ACS table S2503 to help you out with that. And then we have to come up with a housing budget. So the regional average, using that truck driver as an example, the regional average wage for truck drivers is $47,700. And based on the rule of thumb, more than 30% of your salary you should not be paying any more than 30% of your salary towards your housing costs. And so in the case of this truck driver, that would be a housing price or a rental price of $1,192 in terms of what this truck driver is looking for if he's moving into your area or she is moving into your area. The rule of thumb for mortgages is that it shouldn't be more than 4 times your salary. So that in that case, the truck driver who's earning $47,700 can afford a home up to 190,800. And this is important because it gives developers in the region sort of a home price to stick with. Interestingly, we worked 20 years ago in a region that was rural, where an IT firm announced it was coming in at 300 workers. A lot of the people were going to have to come, or a lot of the workers have to come from outside the region. And some investors got very excited, built some condos. Condos were built, workers got jobs. Unfortunately, the builders thought the workers would get paid more, and as a result, that particular apartment building stayed empty for longer than the investors had hoped. I'm going to skip one chart that has a lot of numbers on it, just because in view of time, and also I think many of you would just glaze over looking at it, but we can provide that to you later for those that are interested. Just give me a holler. And let me go just to this conclusion here. So if we're bringing in that transportation warehouse facility in this particular area, which happens to be a rural area, those 818 jobs, we would need to bring in, or we would need to build 40, or have built 44 total units. 32 of them at the bottom you could see would be owner occupied, and 12 would be renter. And you could see the different categories in terms of the monthly housing budgets that we would be supporting as we bring in these this new facility. So with that, let me hand this over to Chris Lloyd, and we'll look forward to your questions at the end.
Great, Chris. Thanks so much. Appreciate the chance to be with everybody this afternoon. First, I want to say again, Chris, thanks to you and your leadership between McGuireWoods Consulting and Chmura firm. We do a lot of work together. Y'all are a very trusted and frequent partner of ours, and that's because we just have such great confidence in the work that y'all do. And obviously the slides that Chris just ran through really emphasize that, just the high quality of work and very, not just relying on old data or anecdotal data, but really diving in deep and looking at issues in a very serious way. And that's so important. And so I want to commend you and the team for all that you do there. As Chris noted at the beginning of the presentation, I'm going to kind of take it from, I'm going to have a little bit of data. I'm not going to play economist. I only have my bachelor's degree in economics, but I will have a little bit of data, but really talk about the role of housing and economic development site selection and really how that has become more important. For those of you who are looking at the poll results that we started with, the question is how many people found that housing has become more important in your economic development conversations over the past 12 months? And 80% of the people had, it was often or in most conversations, nearly every conversation. If you had asked that question just a few years ago, I doubt it would have even broken double digits of the number of people who are having that conversation. We'll talk about that a little bit going forward. I'll first start with a little bit just about give the infomercial here about McGuireWoods Consulting in case you're not familiar with our firm. We are now we were started in 1998 as well. So we just celebrated our 25th anniversary. Actually, we just crossed 26 last week, 26 years. We're now the largest state-based public affairs firm in the country, affiliated with and owned by the McGuireWoods Law Firm with offices all across the country. Mostly focused on state lobbying, federal lobbying, and then I lead what's called the Infrastructure and Economic Development team. So we represent companies in their site selection and economic development incentives work all across the country. Last year, we had 16 announced projects in 8 states, over 2,000 jobs and $35 billion of investment. We've worked economic development projects in nearly every state. Haven't gotten the call to Hawaii yet, but we'll take that flight whenever I need to. Where we really focus on projects, we have a great deal of experience in the food and beverage space, warehouse and logistics, corporate office. And yes, there still are corporate office projects happening in this country. A lot of data center, advanced manufacturing, renewable energy projects. One thing that I think differentiates us as a firm from on a site selection perspective is we are at the intersection of economic development and public policy. And when you think about it, economic development really is driven by public policy, whether it's tax policy, regulatory policy, and other aspects. And since we do have those lobbying capabilities, public relations capabilities, I think that makes it a unique differentiator from McGuireWoods Consulting compared to other firms. I think any of you who are familiar with economic development or practice it every day, you're obviously very, very familiar with the typical economic development drivers that influence companies when they're deciding where they want to relocate or expand in the country or globally. And none of these is going to be a surprise to anyone. Workforce, the availability of workforce, the quality of workforce, the trainability of workforce, how far that workforce has to commute in order to get to jobs. Chris talked about that. Location is always important. But also with regards to location and associated with is the logistics of getting to that location. Some projects, have to be right next to an interstate or another 4-lane highway. Some are port dependent, some are rail dependent, some are air dependent. And those factors obviously impact where an economic development project lands. Tax policy is becoming increasingly important. As many of you who are familiar with what's going on throughout the Southeast, actually not just the Southeast, is a number of states are reducing their corporate income taxes. They're eliminating machinery and tools taxes. And again, that's not just the Southeast. Pennsylvania just cut its corporate income tax in half. And a number of other states are trying to increase and improve their competitiveness from a tax policy perspective. Regulatory policy often drives a number of economic development decisions, whether it's overly stringent environmental policies will chase companies away, and other policies that states or localities can employ either attract or push away economic development projects. And infrastructure, not only tied to the logistics, but just the quality of the infrastructure. How well is it maintained? Is there adequate funding to support infrastructure going forward? So again, those are very typical economic development drivers that I think we're all familiar with. But what we've seen over the past few years, and was alluded to when we talked about the results of the first poll, were some new economic development drivers. First and foremost, and this is why I asked Chris the question about inflation, and that is the importance of speed to market has really come out of nowhere as something that companies are very interested in. When I got into economic development 31 years ago, we'd have several years sometimes to work a project. Now I'm lucky if I get a couple of months to move a project. And, the backhoe in the back of the ribbon cutting ceremony isn't just there for decorative purposes. It may be digging the foundation that day. And companies want to be able to hit the market very quickly, not only because they've got demands from their customers in order to get product or get services out quickly, but material and cost inflation is still very real. I just got a survey today from Gray Construction that said steel prices are now going back up again. You have minimum wage mandates across the country, which are driving up labor rates. You're having other regulatory policies. There's legislation floating in a number of states that require underground infrastructure to be built now, paying prevailing wage. So that's driving up costs. So, if you can get a project through the permitting process in 6 weeks as opposed to 6 months, that alone may save, just in the construction cost inflation, that may save millions of dollars and exceed anything that would be given with regards to economic development incentives. Quality of life and quality of place are becoming increasingly important. Not that they ever were not important, but I think people, companies are making decisions, not just in the short term, but they want somewhere that is attractive for their employees, that is going to be helpful to attracting employees to that location. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And so they really want somewhere that is attractive, that has curb appeal, and is somewhere that they think will attract top talent and retain top talent. We had a client about 5 years ago where all the objective factors lined up for one particular community. They had a great training program. The logistics were incredible. The location was great. The cost was right. We all went out to dinner that night at a downtown restaurant, and we left the restaurant after dark, and all the buildings were boarded up, and it was scary downtown. And the client that moment said, this is not the kind of quality of place that we want for our company to go to. And they went to another community just based on that gut feel for the community. Availability of affordable childcare, just like housing availability and affordability, has really come onto the radar within the past couple of years, particularly because, of course, COVID took a lot of people out of the workforce and they're working remotely, and it also impacted the number of childcare providers. And so the availability of that childcare is increasingly important. And you're starting to see, similar to some of the incentives I'm going to talk about later, when it comes to housing affordability, a number of communities and states are trying to fund more childcare. And then again, the whole subject of this seminar is talking about housing availability and affordability and the importance of that to economic development. Some of that is driven by, we're lucky in this country. We have a growing population. So more people moving in obviously creates more demands for housing. But at the same time, as Chris alluded to earlier, this is instead of just showing the cost increase percentage-wise each year, this just shows you what the average cost of a home is in the U.S. And you see, it grew, but not very quickly until just about 10 to 15 years ago. You've seen we have had a doubling in the price of homes within the past 10 years, and it took almost 40 years for that doubling to occur before that. I remember when I moved out of my parents' house, I bought my first house here in Richmond for $119,000 for a 2-story, 1,600 square foot home. That home just sold last week for $400,000, and it's 26 years older now. It's incredible what's going on with home prices, and wages have not doubled within the last 10 years, and so that's creating quite a squeeze and an issue when it comes to economic development. And as you see, again, this makes it clear that the consumer price index for rent, what's rent going on, it's not just the price of homes, but also rent. You've seen this near almost more than doubling in the average rents over the last 10 to 15 years. So again, home prices are going up, multifamily rental is going up as well. So how are companies, particularly in an economic development context, dealing with affordable housing, and what are some of the trends that I, as a site selector, am seeing from our clients that they're talking about, that you're seeing kind of best practices emerging around the country? You're seeing some companies adding to their benefit pool. Like many companies have started to add student loan assistance to their benefit offering. Some of them are offering down payment assistance or rental assistance as a benefit to their employees, because it is so much cheaper to help subsidize someone to stay in a place than have to retrain a new person because someone leaves because they can't afford to live in a community anymore. And to reduce that turnover, it is worth the several $1,000s a year that a company may spend on down payment or rental assistance to keep an employee, as opposed to having to train someone new to come into a job. You're starting to see companies embracing public-private partnerships. I'll talk about that in a little bit, and how those are being structured. And then corporate development on nearby land, which I'll talk about with some examples coming forward. So companies themselves, the actual employer, is becoming very active. They're not just turning to government, but they're looking inwards and seeing what they can do themselves with private sector solutions to address some of the affordable housing issues. This is another, Chris already mentioned, one Wall Street Journal article. This is one that showed up recently about companies that are actually building housing for their employees and making it affordable near the job site. And this was actually in another article where it showed a company had acquired land nearby, subdivided it, took it through the entitlement process, and was building essentially a company town. Just like the old coal towns or the steel towns that existed at the turn of the 20th century, you're getting these developments with restrictions to say that people cannot flip the houses, because you wouldn't want that to happen. They're having certain commitments with regards to, how long they need to work in the place. Obviously, they're not having to shop at the company store with scrip, like they did in the coal or the lumber towns or the steel towns. But companies are taking an increasingly active role in the development of housing as an important tool for attraction and retention of workforce. And so, that's what companies doing. So let's now look at what communities can be doing. So for those of you who work for state government or local government, what are some of the practices we're starting to see out there? First is the development of land banks. So communities are going out. So they're instead of selling tax delinquent properties on the auction block, they're putting them in a land bank. We have one here in the Richmond area. I know a number of communities are starting to do this, is parking these underutilized properties that are owned by government or, again, tax delinquent properties in land banks, and working with developers to, essentially let that land go for very low cost so that you can develop more affordable workforce housing. You're seeing increased use of and creation of new tax credits to support housing development, whether it's more aggressively going after the federal low-income tax credits or state-based or local tax credits to create more affordable housing. You're seeing communities starting to step up to subsidize infrastructure development. And infrastructure development has always been within the purview of local governments to take the lead on, but they often turn to the development community to pay for that infrastructure. Well, obviously, with the cost of infrastructure going up so much, communities are stepping back in and subsidizing that infrastructure development. And this actually relates to a point further down. Subsidizing infrastructure development, or a point that I'm going to talk a little bit more about later, where they're saying, okay, well, you need this much infrastructure to develop this amount of housing or this factory. Why don't we, the local government, pay to take a 6-inch water line to a 12-inch water line so that we can facilitate additional growth along the corridor down the road, and that will reduce costs for affordable housing coming forward. You're starting to see more flexible zoning in this country. As many of you are aware that historically there have been some very ugly incidents tied to the very ugly racial history of this country, where zoning has been used to discriminate against and keep out certain racial minorities. That doesn't mean that's the only what zoning is for, but unfortunately it has been done in the past. And you're starting to see communities start to get more flexible with regards to their zoning, whether it's affordable dwelling units, accessory dwelling units. So, turning the room over the garage, not just a mother-in-law unit, but actually having it as a housing unit. You're seeing some communities eliminating single family zoning entirely. You're seeing the whole duplex movement really taking off in a number of communities. There's a story on NPR recently about that really taking hold in Minneapolis, and then allowing for increased density. And their increased density through eliminating parking requirements, eliminating or reducing setback requirements, and just realizing that the land is becoming so expensive, the construction materials are becoming so expensive. We need to kind of change the regime that has been used to govern housing construction through the regulatory process to create more of it. We're also seeing economic development authorities themselves get into the affordable housing market. So economic development authorities, for those of you who have them, that they often have very unique powers with regards to acquiring land, being a conduit for financing or development. They often can be a conduit for avoiding and skirting certain taxes. But they always did that in the name of helping corporate growth. You're starting to see some very savvy economic development authorities using those similar powers to develop affordable housing units, either as part of or even completely standalone corporate and office development. Again, they're acquiring land, they're offering tax increment financing through the powers that these economic development authorities use. And again, the very savvy organizations around the country are doing that. And then there's actually the last item I've got here is something of purchase development rights. There's a bill that's now floating through the Virginia General Assembly that would allow localities to come in and buy houses that are 50 and 60 years old, essentially the development rights in hot neighborhoods. The concern, it was expressed, it was yesterday in committee, that you've got these homes that people bought for $10,000, $20,000 in the 40s and 50s. They're now worth $500,000. But the community is so attractive, the person dies, moves away, developers are coming in and demolishing those homes and putting up $1 million McMansions on those houses. So now a person can sell off the development rights to their local community, live in the house, essentially have a life estate to live in the home until they pass on. They get some money for that, and then the community either fixes up the home and maintains as affordable housing, or aggregates, a number of lots next to each other to, again, preserve affordable housing instead of it being flipped over. So whether that spreads or not, I don't know, but it is one of those tools that you're seeing communities look at. For those of you who are looking for some additional tools for how to address housing affordability, this is one study I found from the National League of Cities. There are other tools like the one that Chris talked about, the Virginia Housing has conducted, about how communities can utilize some of the tools that I've talked about to create more and promote more affordable housing for workforce. So with all of that background, in closing, I want to talk about, well, how do you bring up? We did the poll and we said that these discussions are coming up as part of a site selection visit. So what should you, for those of you who are in the economic development world, what should you be doing? How should you initiate that discussion, or how should you respond to that discussion during a site visit? First and foremost, most people do neighborhood tours when they have a prospect in town, but it's more important than ever. And it's not just taking them to one neighborhood, but letting people see again, what your community is doing with regards to developing more affordable workforce housing for the people that will actually work at the facility. So, you're one of the questions you're going to ask of a prospect is, what do your average wages be? And take them to the community for where people can afford that kind of housing. And because that's going to leave a really good impression upon the people that are visiting. Include some of the housing and zoning team in your prospect meetings. A typical prospect meeting, you've got the mayor there and the economic development director. You might have the public works director. But if you've got a director of housing or a director of zoning, that might be a great opportunity for those people to talk about some of the initiatives in your community to address affordable and workforce housing. And include them in there in the prospect meeting so that, again, your corporate prospect can learn about the forward-looking vision that your community has for addressing an important need. Ask the company about what their interest is in public-private partnerships. Is the company willing to undertake some of those down payment assistance or partner with the community on developing underdeveloped land near their site, where, again, the community and the company can work together to develop workforce housing. Bring that up proactively if they don't ask about it, and talk about what your community can do through its economic development authority, its industrial development authority, its housing authority to be their partner. Include, everybody thinks about, a tax abatement or a job grant or training grants. Maybe think about an affordable housing subsidy as part of the incentive negotiations. Say that, if, instead of the money being paid to the company for a worker, sometimes you'll see communities offer $2,000 or $3,000 per job that's created. Say, we'll pay a grant to the developer or to the employee to help them, with down payment assistance as part of your incentive negotiations. You're starting to see a few communities really think about that. Obviously, you need to put some guardrails around it, but that is part of a good incentive to be considered. And then I return to a point that I made earlier about upsizing infrastructure that's needed for industry to facilitate more housing development. That is something that it can if you build it now, it may pay dividends down the road with keeping at least a bit of a cap or controlling some of those costs that are needed to create more housing in the future. With that, I'm sure, I know we've got some questions that are starting to pile up in the chat, but Chris and I would be happy to take any questions from the group. Or Chris, did you have any concluding comments?
I don't at this point, but thanks, Chris, Lloyd. That was a great presentation, very informative, and I think a lot of useful things that our people who have attended here can carry out in their region. I just dropped a link in the chat, the Q&A area, because there was one, and Chris, maybe you can answer this one as well, about childcare and how can you assess whether childcare is affordable. And the link that I dropped in is a study which takes you to some national data that goes down to, it looks like, the county level, so that you could get information about prices for median family and relative to median family income by county. So with that, Chris, do you have any other comments on how is availability of affordable child care measured?
No, I think that I'm glad you had that link, and I think that's a good way. It's not only affordability but also availability, and obviously supply and demand. They're going to be linked in some form or fashion, but just I think that it's going to be important to not only measure again the cost, but just how available is it within the community. There was one comment that I forgot to mention regarding mobility. And we've got this very interesting quandary that's taking place in the policy world right now with regards to, you used to have that, you had companies would go somewhere and people would flock to where the company was located. Now companies are locating in places where, there are a lot of workers because there's a lack of economic mobility, because going back to the points that Chris made earlier, people won't sell their houses because they're locked into good mortgages. They don't want to take on a new mortgage rate at a new location, and there's just not much supply. And so you've got, but at the same time, you look at the federal incentives, the Inflation Reduction Act or CHIPS Act, which are very much steering companies to locate in more distressed communities, more rural communities where there isn't housing. So you've got this weird push-pull that's going on in the policy world, which we do need to reconcile. I did see there was one question that was dropped in. Are communities allocating a portion of industrial park land to develop workforce housing? Yes. I've started to see some of those examples. Chris, you may have some examples as well. Someone actually told me about an RFP that was released in Franklin County, Virginia, a couple of months ago, where they actually had an industrial park which was underutilized, had been set aside 20 or 30 years ago. And the Industrial Development Authority was looking for a partnership with the developer to turn some of that industrial park into worker housing. Now, obviously the issue that you always have is you put housing next to industry. It's like people that locate next to the airport and then complain about the airport noise. You're going to have issues, and you need to think about, buffers and other things. But yes, I've started to see that. Chris, have you seen any incidents or anecdotal signs of that?
Yeah, I'm sure that we had some in our in all of our interviews that we did. So if Patrick, if you're listening in, and if you can chat any examples that you can think of, that would be great. Patrick Clapp was our main researcher on that study. Any other questions?
See, there's one in the chat. How does one provide subsidies and extra infrastructure if corporate taxes are going to be reduced? Obviously, it does still cost, even if you're reducing corporate taxes. North Carolina is cutting its tax. Pennsylvania is cutting its tax. A number of other states, you still need to run government. So you're seeing some of it is, just economic growth is paying for some of the expense, but some of it is just a change in the type of taxation that's occurring. So you're starting to see, states are more relying on sales taxes. They're obviously seeing other revenue sources, whether it's sin taxes, marijuana, gaming, tobacco, alcohol taxes going up. So yeah, you still have the cost of running government. But those are some of the, but again, most people I think are banking on the idea that if you have a growing economy, that's going to bring in additional resources, which allows you to afford some of the reductions to make you more economically competitive. Chris, you may have some thoughts on that as well.
No, that was good. Thank you.
We've got a couple of similarly themed questions in the general chat. One is, with the work from home situation, offices lying fallow, if not already, is there a process to convert offices into residential use? And then another one's talking about incentivizing shopping mall redevelopment for owners that are not just interested. Chris, Lloyd, can you comment at all about the transition of existing infrastructure into affordable housing?
Sure.
There?
I'll keep it very brief. It's very difficult. Everybody said, oh, we'll just take all these empty offices and convert them into housing. And at least the statistics that I've seen is maybe 6% of the office infrastructure in America could be converted easily, because most of it was built in such a way that the plumbing isn't right for it. You think I'm looking across the street at the James Center here in Richmond, and it's a floor plate of 25 to 30,000 square feet. Well, you've got a lot of interior space. Well, who wants an apartment in an interior space of a glass office building? Nobody. And those buildings just weren't built to be converted to office space. So instead, what I've seen is, instead of converting the office space, particularly low-rise suburban office space, to affordable housing, it's just cheaper to blow it up and start over.
Wow. We've heard that as well. And I'm wondering, Chris, what will happen when we go into this next recession that ultimately one day will come? But oftentimes recessions have a way of auto-correcting some trends that we thought would never change.
Yep. And you are starting to see some shopping malls being revitalized. There's here in Richmond, there's great plans for the redevelopment of the Stony Point Fashion Park. We've realized we just don't need all that parking in these malls. A lot of them, just like the suburban office parks that I've talked about, it's cheaper just to demolish them and start from scratch. And they're in great areas. So, they're great for, multifamily and mixed use kind of development.
I see a big question that just came in from Justin.
I'm not seeing. Is that for me, Chris? I'm not seeing.
It's the Q. It's if you click on Q&A only.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, as you're reading that, Chris,
I got it.
Sometimes we're called to do consulting projects just for this very reason. The economic developers want to help the elected officials to think through some of the issues that they're faced with.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I mean, I think you're starting to see the National Association of Counties, like I had up the National League of Cities and others, starting to bring in speakers to educate elected officials on the importance of a lot of these topics. But it is clearly something that requires a great deal more additional information to make sure elected officials understand some of these best practices around the country.
I see a question too from James about whether we have some child care data set. What we have is are the occupations and also the industries, the number of people employed, the number of firms. And since COVID, the number of firms have gone down in terms of those that provide child care. The number of employment based on the region is climbing back up, but the wages are very low for those workers. And so that's one of the issues. We're just going to have to see wages for child care workers rising before we see some real a lot more availability of child care. But if you are not a JobsEQ user, then feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to show you what kind of data we have on child care.
I also see there's this question from Kimberly Swanson regarding, do you have good examples of communities benefit from an opportunity zone designation in the area of housing? You've seen some of that. I've seen some developments in Raleigh, Richmond. There's one in Knoxville, Tennessee. But a lot of it's driven by just luck of the draw. And it's just a census tract that was eligible for an opportunity zone that was already kind of in the path of redevelopment anyway, and they just called away. But, as far as, and so you've seen housing development. The question is how affordable is it? Because opportunity zone financing still is good, but it's expensive, and people are looking for a return on that. And so it is. I think it has been helpful, but it's not been the panacea that a lot of people thought it would be with regards to housing and other sorts of development. Chris, anything you'd add there?
No, that I think says it well.
Okay, I think we will end there. If you have additional questions, concerns, would like to get in touch with Chris Lloyd, Chris Chmura, Patrick Clapp, or any of the consultants at either of our organizations, I can connect you via email. We will send the slides and a recording to this webinar hopefully by tomorrow. Our marketing operations specialist is enjoying some time off, so we will follow up as soon as we have that information available. I appreciate everyone's participation. Chris, anything for the good of the group before we part?
Sure. Thanks again to Chris Lloyd for the wisdom in providing the webinar participants here. And we look forward to continuing to work with you at McGuireWoods.
Thank you.